Disclaimer by Renee. Catherine Ravenscroft is a successful documentary filmmaker celebrated for her hard-hitting investigative stories. At the height of her career, she and her husband, Robert, move into a new home, downsizing now that their son, Nicholas, has moved out. Everything seems fine on the surface, but beneath that veneer, Catherine harbors a deep secret, a secret that has remained hidden for 20 years. Shortly after the move, Catherine stumbles upon a mysterious book titled The Perfect Stranger by E.J. Preston. She doesn't remember buying it, and it's unlike anything she typically reads. But intrigued, she sits down one night and starts delving into the story. At first, the book seems like any other psychological thriller, describing the mundane life of a seemingly ordinary woman. But then, in a horrifying twist, Catherine realizes that the story is about her. The book recounts with shocking accuracy a traumatic, buried experience from her past that she has shared with no one, not her husband, not even her son. Worse, the book distorts the story, depicting her as a morally compromised figure involved in adultery and deception. A chill runs through Catherine as she reads, remembering all too well how close she came to losing everything, including her son, Nicholas. The disclaimer in the book, any resemblance to persons living or dead is purely coincidental, is crossed out in red ink, replaced with a sinister note. This book is about you. The story transports Catherine back to that fateful summer day. She was on holiday alone with Nicholas in Spain. Her husband, Robert, was not with them due to work commitments. Nicholas, a 5-year-old boy at the time, had nearly drowned in the ocean after drifting too far out on a toy dinghy. A man, a stranger, had saved Nicholas, yet Catherine remembers that trip for something much darker. The man who rescued her son was not merely a hero. He had violated her in ways unimaginable, and she had buried the trauma deep in her psyche, determined that Robert and Nicholas would never know. She hushed it up, kept quiet, and tried to convince herself that the violence was part of a distant nightmare that would never reach her family. But the book, The Perfect Stranger, has unearthed her hidden past. At home, Catherine tries to act like everything is fine, but her mind races. How had this book found its way into her home? Who is E.J. Preston? And how does this person know the details of her life? As shock gives way to paranoia, Catherine becomes obsessed with finding out who wrote the book and why. She's also consumed with fear of what might happen if Nicholas, or worse yet, Robert, finds out about her past. Her anxiety increases as she rereads her death at the end of the book, a tragic, terrible, final accident where she is pushed in front of a moving train, leaving her body a shattered and bloody mess. The dark foreboding suggests that someone has a personal vendetta against her, a revenge that may not just be psychological but physically fatal. 2 years earlier, we meet Stephen Brigstock. He's a bitter, retired English teacher, a shell of his former self, mourning the death of his son, Jonathan, who drowned while on holiday as a young man. Stephen is haunted by grief, but also by a gnawing, curdling anger he doesn't entirely understand. As he's sifting through his late wife Nancy's belongings, he stumbles across a manuscript she had written, an unpublished novel. In his loneliness, Stephen takes to reading it, and something inside him fractures when he realizes that the story Nancy wrote aligns disturbingly with the story of Catherine Ravenscroft. Nancy's manuscript deals with Jonathan's past, his fatal drowning while trying to save a child, who Stephen now realizes was Nicholas. Jonathan's brave act had come just minutes after he raped Catherine in her hotel room that night, leaving an indelible scar on her life and twisting Jonathan's final moments into something far more complex than heroic sacrifice. Nancy's manuscript doesn't tell the entire truth, but it hints heavily at the dark side of Jonathan's life, his troubled nature, and Stephen's failure as a father. Nancy had chosen fiction as her confessional, paralleling Catherine's story in hidden subtext. Stephen becomes consumed by his discovery, devastated by both the truth behind Jonathan's actions and by how blind he had been. He realizes the bitter irony. Catherine has lived a haunted life as a result, while he and his wife had lived in self-deception. Desperate for closure or revenge, or perhaps both, Stephen takes it upon himself to self-publish Nancy's manuscript as The Perfect Stranger, making sure Catherine is forced to relive her traumatic past. Stephen's revenge on Catherine is slow and precise. He sends the book to both Nicholas and Catherine, knowing Catherine will read it first and then Nicholas. His tactic is cruel. He wants Catherine to know that someone is watching her, waiting for her to break down under the weight of guilt and fear. He waits for Nicholas, eager for him to discover the fabricated truth woven through Nancy's book, that his mother had an adulterous affair with Jonathan, the man who saved his life, and that Catherine had abandoned him to pursue her lust. Stephen's goal is not only to ruin Catherine, but also to drive a wedge between her and Nicholas, making her pay for Jonathan's death. Catherine is hit with a barrage of mental torment. Nicholas, who already struggles with sporadic mental health issues, falls into further emotional decline after reading The Perfect Stranger. He barely speaks to his mother, and his disappointment and confusion seem to confirm Catherine's worst fears, that Nicholas believes the twisted version of events. Robert starts to notice her strange behavior too, but when she tries to tell him about the book, her unraveling is evident, and he brushes off her concerns as paranoia. The turning point comes when Catherine can no longer bear the pressure and breaks down in tears one night while clutching the book. Robert finds her burning the book in the kitchen sink. Finally, Catherine confesses everything about the holiday in Spain, the attack, the fear she felt for Nicholas, and how she had locked it all away for fear of destroying their family. Robert is devastated and ashamed. Not only does this shatter his perception of their lives, but he feels guilty for not noticing that Catherine had been carrying such a terrible burden all these years. Their marriage, already strained by revelations, teeters on the verge of collapse. But it is Nicholas's plight that pulls them all back toward each other. Nicholas, who has been privately descending into addiction, depression, and despair, takes a dangerous overdose and is rushed to the hospital. Day after day, Robert and Catherine sit helpless at his bedside while the doctors try to bring Nicholas back from the edge. Catherine is haunted by the creeping fear that Jonathan's malevolent shadow is still circling her family, not willing to let them go unpunished. In a climactic moment of release, Stephen, consumed by guilt as well as his sick motivation, meets with Catherine once more. He admits his own moral failings, recounting the full truth about Jonathan's life, and confesses that it was his wife, Nancy, who wrote the book, though he facilitated its publication. He tells Catherine of his intent to get justice for Jonathan, but what he finally realizes is that no one is innocent. As he blames Catherine, he simultaneously hates himself for the monstrous grief he has fed. Nicholas survives his overdose, his recovery slow but steady. Catherine and Robert spend time finding footing once more, caring for Nicholas and nursing their frail relationship back to life. Stephen, with nothing left to live for and crumbling under the weight of all he has unearthed, takes his life by setting himself alight in his garden, consumed both physically and spiritually by the fire of grief and destruction. Eventually, Stephen's death brings Catherine one final odd twist. He leaves behind his property to her in his will, including his old house and his empty flat, clearly a final convoluted act of expiation. Catherine visits the house, pensive, as she walks through the remnants of Stephen's life. She reflects on the trauma and guilt that had unknowingly linked these two families across the span of 2 decades. In the end, Catherine realizes that the only true way to survive is not to forget or bury the past, but to confront it head-on. She accepts that the memories of Jonathan, the horrible night, and Stephen's sad revenge will never leave her. But in looking to her own life and the future of her son, she steels herself for the only fight still worth winning, the one for Nicholas's happiness and for her own sense of self. Disclaimer is ultimately the tale of how secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have the power to break apart lives. Through its tense back and forth between past and present, trauma and recovery, the novel explores the nature of guilt, regret, and the vicious, inescapable cycles of revenge and redemption. If you enjoyed this book breakdown, please consider liking this video and subscribing to get notified when we post our next breakdown.